Okay, I finally got hold of my copy of EZD6 RPG by DM Scotty, published by Runehammer Games via Drive2RPG. I've already gone through the PDF version a few times, played out a couple of test scenarios, and was just waiting to get my hands on the hard copy to do a review of it. This is not a sponsored review, and I'm not affiliated with Drive2RPG. That said, I do think that both DM Scotty and Runehammer are very awesome people, so I am a bit biased, and you may want to keep that in mind as we go through the review. And speaking of awesome people, I'd also like to thank my lovely patrons, Patrick, Michael and Lisa, for making this kind of video possible. Let's get started with the book itself. I got the hardcover version, but you can also get softcover or PDF if that's your jam. The binding looks good, and it's printed on good quality paper. Print on demand can be a bit hit and miss, but I think Drive2RPG nailed it and the book is going to have a good long life. The internal artwork by Sean Bova looks great, but what I especially like is that most of the book is taken up by large friendly text. I love looking at pictures, but sometimes RPG books tend to have massive illustrations and cram tiny text on colored or textured backgrounds. Not here. The level of legibility here is excellent and Runehammer did a fantastic job on the layout. The first part of the book is the How to Play section, which covers the rules and character creation, while the rest of the book is Game Master or Rebel Rouser information, including advice on running the game, stats for common fantasy monsters, stats for new monsters, and a few handy charts. But let's get down to the nuts and bolts of the system. Decades of experience went into designing this, and everything is smoothed and sanded down to perfection. This rule set is the gaming equivalent of aerodynamic. It flies. Pretty much every situation is handled in the same way. A player decides what they want to do, and the Rebel Rouser decides how difficult that is, on a scale from 2 to 6. The player rolls a 6-sided die. If they meet or exceed the target number, they succeed, that's it. Let's say Kind Wilhelm is trying to pick a lock on this door. It's a pretty average lock, so the Rebel Rouser picks a 4-4 difficulty. Wilhelm's player rolls a 6, and the door opens. Play continues. Sometimes you might have a situation where you have opposed rolls. Say some guard spotted Wilhelm while picking the lock and objected to his activity. The guard tries to grapple Wilhelm, so the Rebel Rouser rolls a dice for him. This is the target number Wilhelm has to beat to get free. In this case, he fails and gets pinned down. Nice and easy. I remember when I started playing back in AD&D 2nd edition, the rules for grappling were spread across 3 pages and had modifiers for size, the armor you were wearing, the number of legs you had, and so on. Detailed, sure, but in the end I don't think my group ever did use those rules, because looking them up and calculating was more time and effort than we wanted to sink into it. Here I'm more interested in what happens to Kind Wilhelm than the mathematical reasons for it. Now, heroes are supposed to be able to do awesome stuff beyond what we normal people can do, and EZD6 has 2 mechanics for that. The first one is the hero dice. Each player gets 1 per session, and they can use it to reroll a failed roll. Let's say that the player playing Wilhelm decides to use their hero die to reroll the failed grapple check. This time, they make the roll, and Wilhelm runs off into the night. Going straight by the rules, a success on the hero die means that the character straight up succeeded. In this case, Wilhelm managed to avoid the grapple. Personally, I like to think of these reroll successes as close calls to give them some flavor. Maybe the guard did manage to grab hold of Wilhelm, but he managed to shrug off his coat and left the confused guard holding up an empty garment. In the end, though, you can play whatever way you and your group enjoy most. The other mechanic for saving failed rolls is karma. Players gain 3 karma at the start of each session, and they can use them to boost their rolls. Let's say Hans is searching for a secret door in a room. The Rebel Rouser sets the difficulty at 5, and Hans' player rolls and gets a 3. The player then decides to spend 2 karma to boost the roll by 2 points, so the roll succeeds. Again, this is normally a straight-up success, but narratively I'd play it so that Hans discovers the secret passage by accident, rather than through his own actions. Maybe he gets tired, leans against the wall, and accidentally triggers a button to unlock the door. Again, this is my opinion, and not the rules as written. Karma is a renewable resource, and you get 1 point every time you fail a roll, assuming you don't boost or reroll it. There are only 2 situations where you can't use karma. The first one is if you roll a natural 1 on the dice. You can reroll that with the hero dice, but you can't boost it with karma. The second situation is anytime you're using magic, but we'll get to that later. Obviously, not all characters and situations are created equal, and a straight die 6 roll doesn't really represent a lot of possibilities. The system represents more nuance by using Boons and Banes. Short version, if there's something that will make a task easier, you get a boon and roll extra dice. This can be from favorable situations, a helper, specialized training, and so on. They also stack, so if you have multiple boons, you get multiple dice. Say the Great Oswald is trying to decipher the runes on an ancient portal. The rebel browser rules that this would be a difficult task and sets the target number to 5. However, Oswald spent many years studying ancient runes, and he enlisted the help of one of his buddies. So his player gets to roll 2 extra dice and pick the best result. Banes work the other way around. Let's say that instead of Oswald it's Hans, who has no training but has seen a few things. The runes are damaged, so the rebel browser decides to impose a Bane. Hans's player has to roll 2 dice and pick the worst result. I think this is a very elegant way of handling things, and it's certainly faster than going over a crowded character sheet, getting into an argument about whether you should be using Decipher script or Arcana, rolling a 20-sided die, and adding and subtracting stuff. By now we've gone over pretty much all the core mechanics, but there's one additional rule that applies only to combat. Everything else we covered above still applies, so you still get a target number you roll, you get Boons and Banes, and you still get to use hero dice and karma. If you score a 6 though, the critical hit rule kicks in, and you get to roll another die and potentially score a second hit. If this also comes up as a 6, you get to roll another die, and so on. Now you might ask yourself how likely it is to roll several consecutive 6s, but remember that you can use karma to boost rolls, so if you have enough karma stockpiled, you can come up with some pretty devastating attacks. Let's say Sir Forescale is fighting off some skeletons. He's trained, so he rolls 2 dice and picks the best one. He spent some karma to boost this up to 6 and gains an extra die. He spent some more karma to boost this to 6 and gets an extra die. Let's say he has enough karma left, so he also boosts this and rolls 1 more die. Then he decides that's enough, so he has scored a total of 4 hits. These skeletons can only take 2 hits each, so he obliterates the target. Because he has hits left over, he can assign them to another target within reach, so he wipes out another skeleton. Weapons all cause 1 strike of damage per hit, except for oversized weapons like cannons or giant clubs. I know some people will turn up their noses at this, but personally I find it much easier since you don't need to pick which specific dice roll for damage, or keep a detailed track of how much damage everything has. The numbers are small enough that you can use counters if you need to. Some people will say, "But realism." To which I say, A, we're talking about a game that involves beating goblins up for lunch money, and B, in the grand scheme of things, a battle axe won't make an orc deader than a dagger will. It's just messier. Player characters take damage in the same way, but they do get armor saves to avoid damage. Let's say that the remaining skeleton attacks Sir Forescale and hits. As a warrior with a shield, Sir Forescale has a save of 3 or more, which he rolls avoiding damage. Another thing EZD6 does away with is initiative. Players go first, then monsters. You don't need to keep a detailed chart of who goes before what, which certainly speeds things up. I really want to talk about the magic system because that's one of my favorite parts of the game, but you should probably look at character creation first. Like everything else in EZD6, the character creation is a breeze. First, you pick the general type of character you want to play. They're called hero pots here, and you have a standard choice of fantasy archetypes. Warrior, Warden, Delver, Brute, Rascal, Friar, Conjurer, Beastmaster or Skald. Each of these gives you boons and a couple of special abilities. For example, the Beastmaster gets a boon when dealing with animals, training in melee or range weapons, and a few other goodies like being able to talk to animals. The hero pot you take also defines the number of strikes you can take, and your armor save. With the exception of the Brute, you can take 3 strikes, and that's your maximum for all of your character's career. But we'll talk about that in a second. Next, you choose your race. Human, Elf, Dwarf, Halfling or Goblin. These will give you additional abilities. For example, Elves get Twilight Sight, which lets them see further in low light. Next, you pick inclinations for your character. These are special skills and abilities your character has, and you get 3 if you're a human or 2 if you're anything else. These range from giving you boons to avoiding traps to letting you tap into divine magic, and let you round out your hero. Say you want to play a druid type character. Grab a Beastmaster, slap on the Devout Inclination, and you have yourself a magical forest hobo. You can round your character further with aspects. These are small details about your character which flesh it out, but don't necessarily have a mechanical effect. For example, you could say that your character traveled with a circus when they were younger, or that they were born in a fishing village. It's mostly for flavor, but there are situations when the Rebel Rouser can give you a boon on a roll if you're trying to do something that fits your aspects. Finally, if you're a conjurer, you can get to pick the type of magic you can use. Plenty to pick from, including elementalism, shadow magic, and my favorite illusion. And that's it, you're good to go. Now, the mechanical aspects of a character are pretty much fixed at creation. If you start with 3 strikes, you're always going to have 3 strikes. If you pick the elemental magic, you know how to cast all elemental magic out of the gate, and you're not going to learn any new spells along the way. And that brings me to one of the main criticisms leveled at this game. With no character advancement, this system is only good for single-shot games, yeah? I say nay. First off, the concept of character levels is very artificial. In many systems, it's pretty much like becoming tougher by picking locks, or becoming better at electrical engineering by hitting people with a stick. It's kinda weird, and if it was in any way an approximation of reality, I'd be a latter-day Nikola Tesla. Second, while skills improve with practice, someone who is already competent won't improve that fast. Sure, if your campaign has time jumps of several years, that might be the case, but if you're playing a very long continuous campaign, you might want to represent this improvement in different ways. Third, if you look at most fantasy classics, people don't change very much. Conan or Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser don't really grow as characters as much as they gain and lose treasures, connections, make friends and enemies. Ged from the Earthy cycle doesn't really become a stronger wizard once he's out of school. The entire story is him learning to apply the power he already has more responsibly. The hobbits in Lord of the Rings do pick up a few skills and in 2 cases grow taller, but that's something that could easily be represented in play by giving them extra aspects or even inclinations. Honestly, I think it's a lot more interesting this way, as it works more on the narrative and the story of the characters, rather than just adding up points and hitting some kind of arbitrary threshold. That's just me though, and if you disagree, feel free to drop me a comment to tell me why I'm wrong. Okay, now that's out of the way, I get to talk about the magic system, which is absolutely my favorite part of this game. First off, no spell lists. If you're playing a conjurer, you decide what magical effect you want to create, and it's completely freeform and a hell lot of more interesting than picking prepackaged spells off a list that requires its own index. When casting a spell, the Rebel Rouser determines the difficulty by rolling a die 6. Although more dice may be involved if the caster is trying to affect multiple targets or some kind of magical resistance is in play. In any case, the difficulty is the highest number rolled. Let's say that Oswald is trying to use illusion magic to convince 2 guards that he's the stable boy. The Rebel Rouser rolls 1 die for each target and picks the highest result. This is the target number that Oswald needs to beat for his illusion magic to work. The more targets, the more chances there are for the difficulty to be higher. Now, Oswald's player can choose to roll between 1 and 3 dice to power up the spell, and if any of those dice meet or beat the difficulty, the spell works. There's a catch, obviously. If any of the dice come up as a 1, the spell fails. At this point, the player has a few choices. Obviously, they can just let the spell fail. If they have a hero die, they can use it to reroll once. Finally, the player can opt to use Spellburn to take 1 strike to their damage to remove 1 roll of 1. Remember, a conjurer only has 3 strikes total, so if a critical spell fails with 2 ones, that's going to be a very hard choice. Miracles work in a similar way, though they can be accessed by any class as long as the character has the Devout Inclination. There is also a proviso that miracles may never be used to deal damage. The resistance here is determined by the Rebel Rouser according to the type of the request, depending on how simple or outrageous it is, and it can go from 3 dice for a small divine intervention to a whopping 6 dice for something major like raising people from the dead. Unlike spells, wands or miracles can't be removed with Spellburn, though you can get rerolls by making appropriate offerings. There's a lot to love about this system. Freeform spells allow for a lot of creativity, which is ironically lacking in many magic systems which tend to be very clinical. It also allows for a lot of utility other than lighting things on fire. The risk of failure and the Spellburn mechanic also bump up the stakes. In Dungeons & Dragons I always found it weird that hitting something with a sword had a higher chance of failure than summoning fire from the very fabric of the universe to burn them using magic, so there's that. The way it plays also allows the rebel browser to create situations that encourage the creative use of magic, rather than trying to guess what spells the wizard will have prepared that day. Now, one area where a freeform system might jar with your setting is if you have strictly research-bound magic. You know, where wizards add their magic, set it down in tomes, and so on. A wizard just suddenly creating a new spell on the fly could look a bit weird. Luckily, that can be resolved narratively with a bit of flavor, in presenting the spell they just made up. For example, Oswald hurriedly leaves to the spellbook and says, "Aha! I knew I had just the thing for this. Dresden's discombobulation." Overall, I think the system is an excellent example of how magic systems should be done. One thing I might play with is the spell burn mechanic, so it deals a random effect rather than straight damage. Randomly turning the conjurer inside out is always fun. Now, I'm pretty sure that any group will find something useful in this book, but it will be a better fit for some groups than others. If your group prefers out of combat-oriented or a dungeon crawl type play, I suspect you'd want a crunchier rule system with more variation between weapons and armor and damage types and mechanical rewards. If your group prefers story-driven scenarios and keeping the flow of the narrative is more important than having an exact rule for every situation, EZD6 is a perfect fit. There are just enough rules to keep things consistent without ever having to pause to look something up. The system is an excellent way to get beginners started, as there aren't a ton of different rules to remember, though they might need a bit of guidance. With more rule-bound games like D&D, characters tend to have kind of a built-in menu of things they can do, which makes it easier for beginners to pick an action. With freeform systems like EZD6, it's a blank slate, so some people wouldn't know they can do something just because they haven't been explicitly told they can. They'll probably catch up real quick though, and I'm sure it will take them less time to ramp up than they would to figure out which dice to roll when and what spells they have available and what they do. Overall, this book is a solid addition to many people's gaming library. You can pick it up from Drive to RPG, linked below. But if you're still not convinced and want to hear more about it straight from the horse's mouth, check out my chat with DM Scotty. Bye!